Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, has apparently signed off on a ban against what some people call a terrorist, or at least believing in terrorist views, a guy named Adam Habib, who's going to now be granted a visa to come back into this country to speak at Harvard Law School tomorrow.
First of all, why were you denied a visa?
Well, look, I don't really know. I mean, in principle, there's a couple of theories about why I was denied a visa. The one is that I was denied a visa because I was participating in the anti-war protests. I was involved in the anti-war protests in 2003, particularly in demonstrations and leading demonstrations in Durban, South Africa. Lots of people, there's one reason for that. But there are other people who are also participating in those protests who can come in. And so at one level that makes sense, at another level it doesn't. There was the suggestion that it was racial profiling, that I was really being excluded because of my name and the way I look. And that was one of the reasons that was suggested. Presidency officials in South Africa said to me that they think it's the anti-war protests that were at play. My own favorite theory, of course, is that this is a formula, that there's some formula in this bureaucracy, this American bureaucracy, that starts off by saying you travel a lot and give you a point, and of Muslim background it gives you a point, and is critical of American foreign policy and gives you 2 points, and etc. And I went over a magic number. But frankly, I don't really know. I mean, I think the American government is the only people that really know. What they've done is they've allowed me into the US, they've waived the rationale, but they haven't told me what the rationale in excluding me in the first place is, so I still don't know.
Well, there's some talk that you're somehow linked to terrorist activity. That's what opponents would say. That's what Fox News was blasting about last night.
President Bush banned these men, Adam Habib and Tariq Ramadan, from the U.S. because they allegedly funded terrorist group Hamas. But now Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has reversed that decision, caving to demands apparently by the ACLU so they can speak at Harvard University tomorrow.
Hey, come on, you got to let these guys speak. They're all about telling their side of the story, even though, according to our own Department of State, that these guys have connections to terrorism.
And according to the Associated Press, Mr. Habib, Professor Habib, was banned previously because he's engaged in terrorist activities.
Well, my response is nonsensical. If anybody has an example, put it on the table. I've always been opposed to terrorism, even when I was an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa. I've always opposed it. I don't think it works. I think it undermines and polarizes the struggle even further. I've opposed it all my life. I've stood up and said it. All my writings publicly criticize it. I've spoken publicly in public gatherings that criticize it. So something, it's easy. I come from a country where name calling has consequences. In the mid-1980s, where people were accused of being spies, were killed, they were necklaced in South Africa, they were really murdered by others. So name calling is a dangerous thing. And if Fox News feels that I'm a terrorist, put some evidence at the table. Because to do so without evidence is a very dangerous thing in this world. And it's only irresponsible, or somebody who's particularly irresponsible can do that. If you have the courage for your convictions, put some evidence on the table. Or don't engage in this kind of sully behavior. I mean, I'm stunned at how militaristic some of the discourse has become on the right wing in the United States. I lived here in the early 1990s. I'm stunned how militaristic this discourse has become. And it seems to me that it is precisely this kind of behavior by journalists and Fox, etc., that promotes this kind of militarism that is so dangerous in not only making it dangerous for people like myself, but in undermining the very values that America stands for in its Constitution, in its Bill of Rights, etc. And that's the real tragedy, that these people are allowed to get away with it without the public standing up and saying, excuse me, how dare you do this without any evidence being put on the table? Criticism is the lifeblood of a democracy. That if you don't allow a situation where you are able to be critical, then you don't have a possibility for innovation. You don't have a possibility for accountability in a democratic regime. And that's what's so dangerous about it. If you take a position that criticism of the government is terrorism, then how different have you become from Mugabe in Zimbabwe? How different have you become from Ahmadinejad in Iran? How different have you become from a whole range of autocrats in Myanmar? Because that's the language of the Myanmar generals. It's any criticism of government is actually terrorism, or it is a betrayal of the national state. We have to distinguish. We have to recognize that criticism is a fundamental element of a democracy. It is the lifeblood of a democracy. And if it's not allowed to be entrenched in our society, if it's not allowed to be practiced, then you don't allow accountability, you don't allow innovation in policy, you don't allow fundamentally representation to happen in the way it should be. And that's the real tragedy. When Afghanistan does undemocratic practices, or Gabon, these are small countries where it's a tragedy for their population, but the ripple effects are muted internationally. When the United States as a great power does it, it has huge ripple effects. When the United States starts compromising on its civil liberties, when the United States starts undermining academic freedom, when the United States undermines the freedom of expression, its first principle, its first Bill of Rights, when it does that, it has ripple effect across the system. The legislation of 9/11 that followed the US has begun to entrench itself around the globe with very, very devastating consequences in some contexts. It's eroding the human rights foundation of some societies. There are people, there are autocrats who are using the precedents established in the United States to settle political scores in their own societies. These are dangerous precedents to establish. And the US has a responsibility to play a responsible global role in this regard. And that's something that it hasn't done after 2001, and it particularly didn't do that under the Bush regime. Obama has begun to move away from that, but he needs to follow through and unravel some of the most devastating decisions that were made under the Bush regime.